The morning sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows of Kensington Palace as Princess Catherine sat alone in her private study, her hands trembling as she held the official document. The royal seal at the bottom seemed to mock her as tears blurred her vision. This wasn't how she had imagined her life would unfold when she first walked down that aisle 7 years ago. Prince William entered quietly, his face grave with the weight of recent conversations. He had just returned from a heated meeting with his father, King Charles, and the palace advisors. The discussion had been brutal, filled with ultimatums and threats that would shake the very foundation of their marriage. "They know everything." "Catherine," William whispered, closing the door behind him. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the composed exterior he maintained in public. "The investigation, the financial records, even the private conversations. Father presented it all to me this morning." Catherine looked up at her husband, seeing the man she fell in love with at university, now broken by the impossible position they found themselves in. The scandal brewing beneath the surface wasn't just about money or protocol violations. It ran deeper, threatening to expose secrets that could destroy not just their marriage, but the entire monarchy's reputation. "How long have they known?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The document in her hands detailed financial transactions that had been carefully hidden for months. Money that was meant to help struggling families had somehow found its way into accounts connected to her brother's failing business ventures. William slumped into the chair across from her, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she recognized from their most difficult moments. "The Treasury flagged the irregularities 3 weeks ago. Father's been conducting his own investigation since then. He wants answers, Catherine, and he wants them today." The weight of their predicament settled between them like a physical presence. Catherine had only been trying to help her family, particularly her younger brother who had made poor financial decisions. She never intended for the royal charitable funds to become entangled in personal matters. But good intentions meant nothing when facing the rigid protocols of royal finance. "What did he say exactly?" Catherine asked, though part of her didn't want to know. King Charles had never fully warmed to her, despite her years of dedication to royal duties. This situation would only confirm his suspicions about outsiders joining the royal family. William's jaw tightened as he recalled the conversation. "He said that if we can't provide a satisfactory explanation within 48 hours, he'll have no choice but to recommend a formal investigation. The implications—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Catherine understood. A formal investigation would mean public scrutiny, media frenzy, and quite possibly the end of William's position in the line of succession. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had spent years presenting a perfect image to the public, attending countless charity events, supporting worthy causes, and maintaining the dignity expected of their positions. Now, a moment of personal weakness threatened to unravel everything they had built together. Catherine stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the carefully manicured gardens where tourists gathered daily, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. Those people saw only the glamour and privilege, never imagining the suffocating pressure that came with every decision, every relationship, every moment of their lives. "There's something else," William said softly. "Father mentioned that certain members of Parliament have been asking questions about royal spending. If this becomes public, it won't just be about us. It could trigger a broader investigation into all royal finances." The full scope of their situation began to crystallize for Catherine. This wasn't just about her mistake with the charitable funds. It was about the survival of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. As if reading her thoughts, William approached and placed his hands on her shoulders. "We'll find a way through this, Catherine. We have to. Not just for us, but for our children, for the legacy we want to leave them." But even as he spoke those words, both of them wondered if love and determination would be enough to overcome the forces now aligned against them. The palace walls that had once provided security now felt like a prison, and the future they had planned together seemed to be slipping away with each passing hour. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm, unaware that behind the elegant facade of royal life, two people were fighting for their marriage, their family, and their very survival within an institution that demanded perfection above all else. The emergency family meeting was called for 7 that evening in the king's private chambers. Catherine had spent the afternoon pacing her rooms, rehearsing explanations that sounded increasingly hollow with each repetition. William had locked himself in his office, frantically making phone calls to lawyers and financial advisors, seeking any possible solution to their mounting crisis. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the king's quarters, their footsteps echoed ominously on the polished marble floors. Palace staff they passed averted their eyes, a sure sign that news of the controversy had already begun to spread through the household's intricate gossip network. "Remember," William murmured as they approached the ornate double doors, "we present a united front, no matter what happens in there." King Charles stood with his back to them as they entered, staring out at the darkening London skyline. The Queen Consort, Camilla, sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her expression unreadable. Also present were the king's private secretary, the royal treasurer, and most ominously the family's longtime legal counsel. "Sit down," the king said without turning around. His voice carried a coldness that Catherine had never heard before, even during their most strained interactions over the years. "Mr. Henderson has prepared a summary of the financial irregularities." The royal treasurer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, opened a thick folder and began reading numbers that made Catherine's stomach churn. The amounts were larger than she had realized, the paper trail more complex and damaging than her simple intention to help her brother. In total, Henderson concluded, approximately $2.3 million in charitable funds were diverted through a series of transfers that, while technically legal, violate numerous royal protocols and potentially several laws governing charitable organizations. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine felt William's hand find hers under the table, but even that small comfort couldn't ease the growing dread in her chest. Finally, King Charles turned to face them. His expression was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and something that looked remarkably like grief. "Catherine," he said, her name heavy with accusation, "do you understand what you've done?" Before she could answer, he continued, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about money, this is about trust. The British people trust us to be stewards of their contributions to charity. Parliament trusts us to manage our affairs with absolute transparency. The Commonwealth trusts us to uphold the highest standards of integrity." Catherine found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Your Majesty, I never meant for this to happen. My brother was in serious financial trouble and you thought you could use your position to solve family problems," the king interrupted sharply. "You thought the rules that govern this institution didn't apply to your personal relationships." William leaned forward, his jaw set with determination. "Father, Catherine made a mistake, but her intentions were honorable. Surely we can find a way to resolve this privately, make restitution and—" "Privately?" King Charles laughed bitterly. "William, the Treasury has already flagged these transactions. The Charity Commission has opened an inquiry. 3 different newspapers have reporters asking questions about royal financial management. There is no privately anymore." The legal counsel cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest, we do have several options available to us. Full disclosure and immediate restitution might satisfy the authorities and minimize public damage. At what cost?" Camilla spoke for the first time, her voice sharp. "The monarchy has weathered many storms, but financial scandal in the current political climate could be catastrophic. There are already calls in Parliament for increased oversight of royal spending." Catherine felt the room closing in around her. Every face showed disappointment, anger, or calculation. Even William, despite his support, looked strained by the impossible position she had put him in. "There's another matter," the king said, his tone becoming even more grave. "The investigation has revealed that this isn't an isolated incident. There have been other questionable transactions over the past 2 years, smaller amounts but following similar patterns." This was news to Catherine, and her confusion must have shown on her face, because the treasurer consulted his notes and continued, "Payments to your mother's medical treatments that exceeded the agreed-upon royal medical allowances funding for your sister's educational expenses that weren't properly documented, and several other transfers that appear to benefit the Middleton family businesses. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her brother's recent crisis that she hadn't considered how her other attempts to help her family might appear under scrutiny. Each decision had seemed justified at the time, but viewed together, they painted a picture of someone systematically abusing her position for personal gain. William's grip on her hand tightened, but she could feel his shock at these additional revelations. They had always been honest with each other about major decisions, but these smaller family interventions had seemed too minor to discuss in detail. The total amount, Henderson said quietly, approaches $4.7 million over the 24-month period. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Catherine realized with growing horror that what she had seen as individual acts of family loyalty had created a pattern that looked decidedly criminal to outside observers. King Charles moved to his desk and picked up a document that Catherine recognized as official palace stationery. "I've spent the day consulting with constitutional experts, parliamentary liaisons, and the Prime Minister's office. The consensus is clear. This situation threatens not just your marriage or even William's position in succession, but the very survival of the monarchy in its current form." He looked directly at Catherine, and she saw in his eyes not just disappointment but a kind of terrible pity. "Catherine, you may have loved this family and tried to love this institution, but you've put us all in an impossible position. The question now is whether we can find a solution that preserves the crown, even if it destroys everything else." The following morning brought no relief from the nightmare that had engulfed their lives. Catherine woke before dawn, having barely slept, and found William already dressed and standing by their bedroom window. The sight of photographers gathered outside the palace gates, their long lenses glinting in the early light, confirmed their worst fears. "They know," William said without turning around. "The story breaks in 2 hours across every major outlet. Henderson called at 5 this morning. Someone leaked the Treasury investigation." Catherine pulled on her robe and joined him at the window. The crowd of media personnel was larger than anything she had seen since their wedding day, but the atmosphere was entirely different. These weren't well-wishers hoping to capture a romantic moment. These were hunters sensing blood in the water. "What exactly do they know?" she asked, though part of her didn't want the answer. William handed her his phone, which displayed the draft headline from the Times: "Royal charity funds diverted to Princess's family, palace in crisis." Below it was a detailed timeline of transactions, complete with bank account numbers and dates that matched the Treasury investigation with devastating accuracy. "They have everything," William said, his voice hollow. "The amounts, the accounts, even quotes from unnamed palace sources expressing deep concern about the princess's judgment." He turned to face her, and she saw exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "Catherine, whoever leaked this didn't just want to embarrass us. They wanted to destroy us completely." The implications began to sink in as Catherine read through the articles on multiple news websites. This wasn't just a financial scandal. It was being framed as a fundamental breach of public trust. Editorial columns were already calling for her resignation from all royal duties, while political commentators questioned whether the monarchy could survive such a betrayal of public confidence. "We need to call the children's school," Catherine said suddenly, maternal instinct cutting through her personal anguish. "They'll need additional security, and the teachers should be warned about media attention." William nodded grimly. "I've already spoken to their security detail. The children will be kept inside during breaks today, and we're arranging for them to come home early." He paused, running his hands through his hair. "Catherine, how do we explain this to them? George is old enough to understand that something terrible is happening." Before she could answer, there was a sharp knock at their door. William's private secretary entered, her face pale with urgency. "Your Royal Highnesses, I'm afraid the situation has escalated further. The Prime Minister's office has called an emergency meeting with His Majesty. There are questions being raised in Parliament about the future of royal funding entirely." Catherine sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what her actions had unleashed. She had tried to help her family, but in doing so, She had potentially triggered a constitutional crisis that could end the monarchy altogether. There's more, the secretary continued reluctantly. The Charity Commission has announced a formal investigation, and the Metropolitan Police have confirmed they're reviewing the matter for potential criminal charges. The word criminal hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had never considered that her family assistance could be viewed as theft or fraud, but she was beginning to understand how naive that perspective had been. William's phone rang, and Catherine could hear King Charles's voice through the speaker, though she couldn't make out the words. William's responses were clipped and formal. "Yes, sir. I understand. We'll be there immediately." When he ended the call, William turned to Catherine with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of love, desperation, and something that might have been goodbye. "Father wants to see us in 30 minutes. He's been on the phone with constitutional lawyers all night." William sat down across from her and took her hands in his. "Catherine, I need you to understand something. The palace's primary concern right now isn't our marriage or even my position as heir. It's survival of the institution itself." "What does that mean?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "It means they're going to ask you to take full responsibility, resign from all royal duties, and possibly—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Catherine understood. "A separation, possibly even a divorce, might be necessary to distance the crown from the scandal." "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. William's silence was answer enough. The palace had weathered many storms over the centuries, but always by sacrificing individual members when necessary. The institution would survive even if it meant destroying the people within it. "I won't let them do this alone," William said finally, his voice filled with quiet determination. "If they force you out, I'll abdicate. We'll face whatever comes, together." Catherine looked at her husband, the man who had been born to be king, who had spent his entire life preparing for that role, and realized the full cost of her mistakes. Not only had she potentially destroyed her own future, but she was forcing the man she loved to choose between his duty and his family. "You can't do that, William. The monarchy, your father, your children, they need you to be king someday." "I need my family intact more than Britain needs another king," William replied firmly. "We've always said we were a team, Catherine. I meant that then, and I mean it now." As they prepared to face King Charles and learn their fate, Catherine couldn't help but think about the young woman who had walked into this family with such hope and determination. That woman had believed love could conquer any obstacle, that good intentions could overcome any mistake. Now, as she prepared for what might be the fight of her life, she wondered if that young woman had been incredibly brave or simply incredibly foolish. The palace bells chimed the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but potentially the end of everything they had built together. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just their personal future, but the future of an institution that had endured for over a millennium. The meeting with King Charles was unlike anything Catherine had experienced in her 7 years as a member of the royal family. The room was filled with advisors, constitutional experts, and government officials, all wearing expressions of barely contained crisis. The Prime Minister himself sat at the king's right hand, his presence making clear that this had become a matter of national importance. "The situation has deteriorated significantly overnight," King Charles began without preamble. "The public reaction has been swift and severe. Polling conducted this morning shows a 20-point drop in support for the monarchy, with 63% of respondents calling for Catherine's immediate removal from all royal duties." Catherine felt William tense beside her, but she forced herself to remain composed as the king continued his devastating assessment. "More concerning are the political ramifications. 3 Commonwealth nations have already announced they're reviewing their constitutional ties to the crown. The Scottish Parliament is discussing accelerated independence proceedings, citing this scandal as evidence of Westminster's inability to provide proper oversight of royal affairs." The Prime Minister leaned forward, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid I must be direct. My government cannot continue to support the monarchy in its current form if these allegations prove true. The opposition is calling for emergency debates on royal funding, and several of my own party members are wavering in their support." Catherine realized that her personal crisis had mushroomed into a constitutional emergency that threatened the very existence of the British monarchy. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. "What are our options?" William asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil Catherine knew he was feeling. The King's legal counsel opened a thick folder. "We've identified 3 possible courses of action, each with significant consequences." He cleared his throat formally. Option 1. Princess Catherine accepts full responsibility, faces criminal charges if filed, and divorces Prince William immediately to distance the royal family from the scandal. The word divorce hung in the air like a death sentence. Catherine had known it was a possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud in such clinical terms made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. Option 2, the council continued. Prince William abdicates his position in the line of succession, and both he and Catherine renounce all royal titles and privileges, essentially exiling themselves from the institution. William's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as the legal expert outlined their final choice. Option 3. We attempt to manage the crisis through full transparency, complete restitution, and significant reforms to royal financial oversight. This path keeps the family intact but subjects the entire monarchy to unprecedented scrutiny and potential dissolution if public opinion doesn't recover. King Charles stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the protesters who had begun gathering in the square. Their chants were audible even through the thick palace walls. Demands for accountability, for justice, for an end to royal privilege. "Each option has been carefully analyzed," the king said without turning around. "Option 1 preserves the monarchy, but destroys your marriage. Option 2 preserves your marriage but potentially destabilizes the succession. Option 3 risks everything but offers the possibility of redemption." Catherine found her voice for the first time since entering the room. "What would full transparency actually mean?" the Prime Minister answered, his tone businesslike. "Complete disclosure of all royal finances for the past decade, submission to ongoing parliamentary oversight, and likely criminal prosecution for any laws that have been broken. You would face trial, Princess Catherine, with all the media coverage and public scrutiny that entails." "And our children?" William asked, his parental instincts overriding all other concerns. "Under any scenario, the children would retain their titles and positions in succession," the legal counsel assured them. "However, their upbringing would be significantly affected by the choices made here today." Camilla spoke for the first time, her voice filled with barely controlled emotion. "Catherine, I want you to understand something. This family has survived scandals before, but always by making difficult choices. Sometimes that has meant sacrifice, sometimes exile, sometimes worse. What matters now is not what's fair, but what preserves the institution for future generations." Catherine looked around the room at faces that had once welcomed her, or at least accepted her as family. Now she saw calculation, fear, and in some cases, barely disguised relief that the problem might be solved by her removal. Only William's expression showed unwavering support, and even that was tinged with the terrible knowledge of what they faced. "I need to speak with my husband privately," Catherine said, standing with as much dignity as she could manage. "Before any decisions are made, we need to discuss this as a family." King Charles nodded curtly. "You have 1 hour. After that, we need a definitive answer. The longer this uncertainty continues, the more damage is done to the crown." As they left the room, Catherine could hear the advisors immediately begin discussing contingency plans, as if she and William were already gone. The sound of their former life being dismantled followed them down the corridor like an echo of everything they were about to lose. Back in their private chambers, William closed the door and leaned against it as if trying to keep the outside world at bay. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had thought their love could overcome any obstacle, now faced with choices that seemed impossible to make. "What do you want to do?" William asked softly. Catherine moved to the window, where their children's voices could be heard from the garden below, playing with their nanny, blissfully unaware that their world was about to change forever. She thought about the young woman who had married into this family with such hope, and the reality of what royal life had actually demanded. "I want to fight," she said finally, turning back to William. "Not just for us, but for what this family could become. Maybe this crisis is exactly what the monarchy needs. A chance to prove it can evolve, can be transparent, can earn the public trust instead of simply expecting it." William moved to stand beside her, placing his arm around her shoulders. "It won't be easy. We'll face criminal charges, media scrutiny, public hatred. Our children will grow up with this shadow over their lives. But they'll also grow up seeing their parents fight for what's right, seeing that accountability and transparency aren't things to fear, but things to embrace," Catherine replied. "William, we can either let this destroy us, or we can use it to build something better." As they prepared to return to the meeting room with their decision, both of them understood that they were not just choosing their personal future, but potentially reshaping the monarchy for generations to come. The next few hours would determine whether love, transparency, and determination could triumph over centuries of tradition, secrecy, and institutional self-preservation. Their decision to fight sent shockwaves through the palace that reverberated far beyond the ornate walls. When William and Catherine returned to the meeting room and announced their choice to pursue full transparency, rather than separation or abdication, the reaction was immediate and divided. "This is madness," declared the king's private secretary, his composure finally cracking. "You're gambling with an institution that has survived for over 1,000 years. One misjudgment, and everything ends." But King Charles himself remained silent for several long moments, studying his son and daughter-in-law with an expression that Catherine couldn't quite read. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried both resignation and, perhaps surprisingly, a hint of admiration. "You understand that this path offers no guarantees, that we may lose everything anyway, but with far more public humiliation and constitutional chaos?" "We understand, Father," William replied firmly. "But Catherine is right. Perhaps this is exactly the crisis the monarchy needs to prove its relevance in the 21st century." The next 72 hours became a whirlwind of legal preparation, media strategy, and internal reorganization that transformed the palace into something resembling a war room. Constitutional lawyers worked around the clock to prepare for unprecedented parliamentary scrutiny, while communications experts crafted a public response that would need to balance accountability with institutional survival. Catherine found herself at the center of preparations for what amounted to the trial of her life, not just in legal terms but in the court of public opinion. Every financial transaction would be examined, every decision questioned, every motive analyzed by people who had never faced the impossible balance between family loyalty and royal duty. "The key is to control the narrative from the beginning," explained Sarah Mitchell, the crisis communications expert brought in to manage the media response. "We admit mistakes, show genuine remorse, but frame this as a learning experience that will make the monarchy stronger." But even as the professionals strategized, Catherine struggled with the personal cost of their decision. Her parents, already under intense media scrutiny, were facing harassment that forced them into hiding. Her siblings were losing business, contracts, and facing social ostracism. The ripple effects of her choices were destroying the very people she had tried to protect. "I'm ruining everyone's lives," she confided to William during one of their brief private moments. "Maybe the palace advisors are right. Maybe I should just take responsibility and disappear quietly." William pulled her close, his voice fierce with determination. "Catherine, your family knew the risks when you married into this institution. They've also benefited from the privileges." "What we're doing now, taking responsibility publicly, submitting to oversight, that's what real leadership looks like." The morning of their first public statement arrived with unprecedented media attention. Every major news outlet in the world had representatives outside Buckingham Palace, while social media buzzed with speculation, condemnation, and surprisingly, some support for their decision to face the crisis head-on. Catherine stood before her mirror, putting on the navy blue dress that communications experts had chosen to project both seriousness and approachability. Her hands shook as she applied makeup to cover the exhaustion and stress of the past week. This would be the most important, public appearance of her life. "Ready?" William asked, appearing behind her in the mirror. He looked as nervous as she felt, but his presence steadied her racing heart. "As ready as anyone can be for public humiliation on a global scale," she replied with a weak smile. The press conference was held in the palace's stateroom, with cameras from around the world capturing every word, every expression, every gesture. Catherine sat beside William at a simple table, the opulent surroundings serving as a stark reminder of the privilege she was accused of abusing. "I stand before you today to take full responsibility for serious errors in judgment that have brought shame to the royal family and betrayed the trust of the British people," Catherine began, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "There are no excuses for my actions, only explanations, and I owe you both." She proceeded to detail every transaction, every decision, every moment where family loyalty had clouded her judgment about royal protocols. The admission was comprehensive, painful, and unlike anything the British public had ever heard from a member of the royal family. "I allowed my love for my family to compromise my duties to this institution and to you, the people who support it," she continued. "I understand that trust once broken must be earned back through actions, not words." William then spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his future kingship but also the vulnerability of a husband defending his wife. "Princess Catherine's mistakes were hers alone, but my decision to stand by her, to fight for our marriage and our family, is mine. We believe that transparency, accountability, and genuine reform serve the monarchy better than convenient separation." The questions from journalists were brutal, probing every aspect of their decision and demanding details about criminal investigations, parliamentary oversight, and the future of royal funding. But somehow, Catherine found strength in the honesty of the moment. After years of careful public statements and diplomatic non-answers, there was something liberating about simply telling the truth. The immediate public reaction was mixed but more positive than palace advisors had predicted. While traditional monarchists expressed outrage at the unprecedented admission of wrongdoing, younger demographics responded favorably to what they saw as genuine accountability from an institution historically resistant to transparency. "The polls are actually encouraging," Sarah Mitchell reported that evening. 57% of respondents appreciate the honesty, even if they don't approve of the original actions. More importantly, support for the monarchy as an institution has stabilized. But Catherine knew their real test lay ahead. Criminal investigations would proceed, parliamentary oversight would be implemented, and every aspect of their lives would remain under scrutiny for years to come. The question was whether their marriage, their family, and ultimately the monarchy itself could survive that level of transparency. As she tucked her children into bed that night, answering their innocent questions about why there were so many cameras outside, Catherine realized that whatever happened next, she and William had chosen a path that their children could be proud of. They had chosen truth over convenience, accountability over privilege, and love over institutional preservation. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, Catherine felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. 6 months later, Catherine stood in the same palace garden where the crisis had begun. But everything had changed. The formal parliamentary inquiry had concluded with a mixed verdict. While her actions had violated protocols and required significant reform of royal financial oversight, the criminal investigation had been dropped due to lack of intent to defraud and complete cooperation with authorities. The monarchy had survived, but it had been fundamentally transformed in the process. New transparency requirements meant that royal finances were now subject to annual parliamentary review, a development that had initially horrified traditionalists, but gradually gained public approval. The institution that emerged from the scandal was leaner, more accountable, and paradoxically more popular than it had been in decades. "The children are asking if they can invite friends over again," William said, joining Catherine by the rose bushes where she had been reading the morning newspapers. The media attention had finally begun to calm, though their family would never again enjoy the privacy they had once taken for granted. "What do you think?" Catherine asked, looking up from an editorial praising the new transparency of the modern monarchy. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest mistake had become the foundation for institutional reform that historians would likely view as inevitable. I think our children are learning that actions have consequences, but also that facing those consequences with honesty and dignity is what defines character, William replied, settling beside her on the garden bench. They're going to be stronger for having lived through this. The personal cost of their decision had been enormous. Catherine's relationship with her own family remained strained, though slowly healing. Several palace staff had resigned, rather. Then work under the new transparency requirements and certain long-standing traditions had been abandoned as incompatible with modern accountability standards. But there had been unexpected benefits as well. Public engagement with royal activities had increased dramatically. Charitable contributions to royal-sponsored causes had reached record levels, and polling showed that younger generations viewed the monarchy more favorably than they had in decades. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked, the question that had haunted her through months of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and institutional restructuring. The choice to fight rather than simply let me take the blame and disappear? William considered the question, seriously, as he always did when Catherine asked about the road not taken. "I regret that you had to go through public humiliation for trying to help your family. I regret that our children had to see their mother attacked in the media. I regret that an institution I love had to be torn apart and rebuilt." He paused, taking her hand in his. "But I don't regret choosing our marriage over convenience. I don't regret proving that the monarchy can evolve. And I certainly don't regret showing our children that when you make mistakes, you face them together, as a family." The sound of laughter from the palace drew their attention to where Prince George and Princess Charlotte were playing with their security detail, in a game that looked suspiciously like paparazzi and royals. Even in their innocence, the children had adapted to a reality where their lives were more public than previous royal generations had ever experienced. "Lady Mitchell wants to meet next week about the Transparency Initiative rollout to the Commonwealth nations," Catherine said, reviewing her schedule. The crisis that had nearly destroyed her had also created opportunities to influence institutional reform across the royal family's global presence. "And Father wants to discuss the succession planning modifications," William added. "The new oversight requirements mean significant changes to how future monarchs will be prepared and monitored." It struck Catherine how completely their roles had evolved. Instead of being the picture-perfect royal couple attending charity galas and ribbon cuttings, they had become reformers, working to drag an ancient institution into the modern world, whether it wanted to come or not. The irony was that this new role suited them better than their previous life had. The constant pressure to be perfect had been replaced by the more manageable expectation that they be human, accountable, and genuine in their service to the crown and country. "There's something I need to tell you," William said, his tone becoming more serious. "Father spoke to me yesterday about the timeline for my eventual accession. The reforms we've implemented have actually strengthened public confidence in the EU succession, but they've also accelerated his plans for transition." Catherine looked at her husband, seeing not the broken man who had stood by her during the darkest days of the scandal, but someone who had grown into his future role through crisis and adversity. The man who would someday be king had been forged in fire, and the monarchy would be stronger for it. "How do you feel about that?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. The reluctant prince who had once dreaded the weight of the crown had been replaced by someone who understood that leadership meant serving others, even when that service came at enormous personal cost. "Ready?" William said simply. "For the first time in my life, I feel truly ready to serve as king. Not because I was born to it, but because I've learned what it really means to put duty above personal comfort." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, King Charles appeared on the garden path, his daily constitutional bringing him past their secluded corner. The relationship between father and son had been permanently altered by the crisis, but perhaps for the better. The king's initial anger had evolved into something approaching respect for the difficult choice they had made. "Good morning," he said, settling into a nearby chair with the casual familiarity that had replaced the formal protocol of their previous interactions. "I trust you've seen the Commonwealth response to our transparency proposals?" "Mostly positive," Catherine replied, still amazed that she was now included in these discussions as an equal partner rather than a potentially problematic spouse. Though the Canadian Parliament wants additional oversight provisions, which we'll provide, King Charles said firmly. The days of assuming royal prerogative extends beyond accountability are over. Your crisis taught us that, Catherine, and history will thank you for it, even if the present moment couldn't. It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever receive from her father-in-law, and Catherine found it sufficient. The king had acted to protect the institution he served, just as she had acted to protect the family she loved. The collision between those loyalties had nearly destroyed them, all but had ultimately created something stronger. The children want to know if they can attend regular school next year, William said, broaching a topic they had discussed extensively. With the new transparency requirements, the old arguments about privacy and security seem less relevant. King Charles nodded thoughtfully. The Norwegian model has worked well for them. Royal children attending normal schools, living relatively normal lives, understanding the world they'll someday serve. He paused, looking toward the palace where the sounds of governmental meetings and constitutional discussions continued daily. Everything is changing, isn't it? Everything needed to change, Catherine said quietly. We just provided the catalyst. As the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the garden where so many royal dramas had played out over the centuries, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The young woman who had married into the royal family with dreams of fairy tale romance had been naive about the realities of institutional life. But the woman who had survived scandal, public humiliation, and constitutional crisis had learned something far more valuable than romantic fantasy. She had learned that real love meant standing together through impossible choices, that real leadership meant accepting responsibility for mistakes, and that real change often required breaking things before they could be rebuilt better. The palace bells chimed the hour, marking another day in a monarchy that had been transformed by crisis into something more honest, more accountable, and ultimately more worthy of the people it served. Catherine took William's hand and stood, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that they would face them together, with transparency instead of secrecy, with accountability instead of privilege, and with love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. Behind the palace walls, the ancient institution continued its work, but it was no longer the same monarchy that had existed before Catherine's tears had unveiled a painful truth. It was something new, something better, something that their children could inherit with pride rather than burden. And that, Catherine realized, was worth every moment of pain they had endured to achieve it.